click record, and then I'm going to lean back, and I can always cut out the other stuff. So,
all right.
I always start with hi, hello. I don't know why, but that's what I'm committing for. So,
Okay.
Hi, hello, everybody. Thank you for clicking on another Truthful Ministry podcast. So this is going to be technically episode 2. I just finished recording episode 0 yesterday, and episode 1 was with Carson, so hopefully you've already watched those. But today I'm here with Cody Lewis. He is a youth pastor in Hallsville right now. I've known Cody for a little bit, but he's one of the just definitely most spiritually wise people I know, and we have a good thing going where we kind of constantly meet, and we have like accountability meetings and just talk about what's going on in our lives. And so I just knew immediately when I thought about doing a podcast that he was going to be one person that I really wanted to have on here. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and start the same way I did with Carson and with all my guests. Is just how did we meet from your perspective? How did you and I meet? When did that happen?
I think we met when my now wife, girlfriend at the time, was still in college. Because you all went to high school together, and then you all went to the same college. And I don't remember exactly at what point we met in there, but somewhere in there when she was in college and you all were in college. Mm-hmm. I was around.
Yeah.
So we met somewhere in there, and then eventually we just kind of became friends.
Yeah. I think it worked out. I forgot to say, too, to introduce Cody more. Cody, again, youth pastor, but also husband, good friend, homie, and soon to be, at some point soon, father looking like. So
Yep.
That's awesome. But yeah, you're married to a girl named Courtney. You said we went to the same high school. We have a funny story where Courtney was in one of my classes, and I just forgot. I never really paid attention to notice her, so I didn't really meet Courtney until college. But yeah, I think I knew you briefly in college through Courtney, and it wasn't until we started kind of playing board games together and like we played Dungeons and Dragons together. Then it was like, oh, dude, this guy's a Christian, and he's also kind of a nerd. I was like, we're really gonna bond here. So that's how we got a lot closer. Yeah, and I think that's probably been. Gosh, I was a junior, so it's been like, what, 5 years maybe?
Something like that.
I think we've probably known each other
That's wild.
Closer for like 5-ish years, something like that.
That's wild to think about. Yeah.
So, hopping right in, first question I have for you. As a married man now, what's one piece of advice that you would maybe go back and give engaged Cody or even relationship Cody? Just like, what's one big thing you feel like you've learned in the season of marriage, like being married now?
I think to say a couple of things, but one big thing, one quick thing is that it's been very good. And there's a lot of stuff out there about marriage being a bad thing or a difficult thing or whatever. Yeah. I mean, it has its challenges just like anything else worth doing. But it's a good thing.
That's good.
I think as far as advice I would give to pre-married Cody is that all of the things that are challenging before you get married are still challenging after you get married. Like putting the ring on doesn't just magically make things like work. I think I had this kind of childish view of life when I was growing up that like, once I become an adult, this will be easy.
For sure.
Or once I get married, then these things won't be a problem anymore. This will be easy. That's not true. Yeah. And also the patterns that you establish before you get married, you'll carry into your marriage. Mm-hmm. And so, if there's good things, and you're like, well, this would be really good, but it'll be easier once we get married, and we'll just start that. And it's like, we'll just start working on those rhythms now. They'll carry over, they'll transfer over. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I still fall into that sometimes. Like, I think it's just the natural procrastination. Like, no one wants to deal with sin or with their problems. Like, that always seems so tough. And so you think, oh, well, when I get to this point, then I'll do it. Or when I get to here, I've definitely heard that a lot, too. You're not the first person I've heard say that about marriage, just, like, addressing those things early. So moving more personal, I was going to ask you a little bit about, like, your story. Like, I obviously already know some of the details, but just speak on just kind of where your faith was when you were a kid or growing up and how it's grown into what it is today.
Yeah. Well, I didn't grow up in a Christian family. I think the best you could describe is we were on the far edge of being nominal Christians. I grew up without a dad in the home, so it was just my mom and then various guys throughout the years. And at no point during that was my family ever the kind that we went to church regularly. We were at best Easter and Christmas, and most of the time not even that. My experience with the church as a child, like elementary school age, the only thing there was every summer, for whatever reason, by God's providence, I went to this Christian camp every summer for like a week. And I was immersed in the gospel there. And then my best friend growing up, his family were Christian, but they were like not normal. Like they didn't go to church regularly. They were very on the outside of like that stuff, but they would have definitely called themselves Christians. They're pretty zealous people. And so I guess coming to faith, then it wasn't through my family taking me. It wasn't for me just naturally being at church. It was my friend. His name was Noah. When I was in middle school, about 7th grade, he invited me to go to a D-Now event. And I didn't have anything else going on, so I went. And I'd heard the gospel before, kind of live in the Bible Belt. You can't avoid hearing about Jesus.
Yeah.
But it was the first time that I really ever heard it in such a way that I had a Father in heaven who loved me and cared about me, and that Jesus loved me so much that he came willingly and died for me, and that my Father knew my sin better than I did. He knew how messed up I was better than I did, and he still loved me. He still wanted me in his life, and he still wanted to adopt me as his son. And yeah, the weight of conviction hit me. I understood my sin for the first time truly, and I gave my life to Christ that day. That was March 20th, 2010. I only know that because I had a Bible that was gifted to me while I was there, and I wrote it in there. But yeah, since then, I didn't start going to church for a couple years after that, just because my family didn't go, so what do you do? And then when I was in high school, I started going regularly, and that's when I started getting a lot more serious about my faith and serving and membership and all of that.
That's awesome. So, I mean, if you haven't already listened, on my channel I have like a video that's kind of like my life story I recorded a few years ago, but there's definitely some similarities there. I also didn't grow up going to church at all, and so it was also in my life someone kind of inviting me, like a friend who knew Jesus, that kind of pulled me in. So let that be encouragement to anybody listening. Like when people say like, oh, you should tell your friends about Jesus and stuff, like that matters. Like it may not work 99% of the time, but the one person you do bring to church, could end up being a pastor, could end up being just either way saved no matter what they do. So that's huge. That's really cool. So keeping going in your story, now that we know like a little bit about you, like what brought you to ministry from there? So didn't grow up in a church, friend brings you to a camp, you start getting saved, get a little more active in high school. At what point did you think like you really felt like God was calling you to ministry? And kind of when he did around that time, like what was maybe some of the challenges, if there were any? Were you doubting at all?
Yeah. So I guess to give some backstory to it, I was not like a kid that was involved in stuff after school. Like I didn't do any after school programs. I didn't do sports or anything growing up. I was very much the school's out, or I'm going to go home and, play PlayStation or whatever. I'll lock myself in my room and just until I go to bed and have to go to school tomorrow. And so when I started getting involved in church, there was plenty of time in my schedule to devote to it. And so there was kind of two levels there that played into it of I didn't have any kind of Christian community in my home. And so I was really hungry for it. And so that drove me to the church and made me really yearn to be at church as much as possible because I could be around other believers. And then I had the time to do that. I didn't have anything else conflicting in my schedule. And so I was just in high school at youth, at church for everything that was going on. I always joke, we would do like fundraisers and stuff. And we would have some fundraisers that would be done over multiple days. And for any of the youth to be eligible for the money that was raised in the fundraiser, you had to show up for at least one like block of time that you signed up for over the course of those days. And I would consistently just be like, well, I guess I'll just sign up for all of them. I was just always there. But I just loved it. And then through that, I was given opportunities to be in the leadership in our youth group. We had a leadership team. I was on the worship team in our youth group. And so I had multiple opportunities to kind of be in leadership positions. And then going into my junior year of high school, that summer before that, really, I guess that spring before my junior year, I started really feeling God pulling me that, doing this, serving and ministry and leading in this way is what he wants me to do. And talking about any kind of doubts or anything, I feel like a lot of people have doubts in one direction, but my doubts are more so like, is this really God calling me to this, or am I just making this up because I just really enjoy being here?
For sure.
And I was the only high school boy that came regularly in my youth group, and so I was kind of naturally in a leadership position as a result of that. Mm-hmm. And so I had a lot of doubts of like, am I actually good at this, or am I naturally a leader, or is it just
like a situational thing?
Yeah. And so I remember when we went to camp that summer, we went to Centrifuge Camp in Ridgecrest, and I remember praying before I went, asking God. While I was in an environment where I wasn't surrounded by just my youth group, because I was going to be in situations where I was the only person from my youth group in the people around. I remember asking God, if this is what you want me to do, make it really clear to me here. And I remember he answered that prayer. We had small group times at camp where it was me with a bunch of other students that I'd never met before, and just kind of naturally fit into a leadership role in those discussions, for better or for worse. But I remember when that happened, just God speaking, being like, there's your answer. Now quit messing around.
Yeah.
It's time to get real. And then after that, we got done, and I told my youth pastor, and he was, he guided me through the process of confirming that I was really called to it. And he really tested the waters. His policy was definitely, I'm going to give you every reason not to want to do this, and if you still want to do it at the end, then you know that God's calling you to it.
That's cool.
So he would just tell me he let me peek behind the curtain at all the stuff that makes ministry difficult and unpleasant and hard, and he's like, it's going to be really lonely, and you're not necessarily going to get a good paycheck, all this kind of stuff. You sometimes have to deal with parents who just don't like you. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if I tell you all this and you still are raring to go, then that's the only way that you know that you're called to it. I was like, well, I can't imagine doing anything else. So
I like the other day too, talking about like ways we had a big board game day where we played this board game that lasted like 10 hours, and man, I put down like a whole pizza by myself probably. And I was like, guys, I don't know what it is. Like normally I don't eat very much, but I was like, I can put down pizza. And Cody said, that's the youth pastor's spiritual gift. Like,
yeah.
That's how you know, or something.
You got that extra pizza organ in you if you do youth ministry.
Just some other notes too from listening to that. Like, I think it's really important for anyone in ministry, just talking about how like you always wanted to go to like the church, like you were always there, you signed up for everything. I often think about, that was kind of my experience too. Like I didn't get to go as often because our church didn't do a whole lot of stuff. Like there weren't too many opportunities, but when I did have the opportunity, I would go. Like I interned at my church so I could get out of school early, and I volunteered for like all these different events when I could. And it just kind of felt like my church at that time really became like a second home in a way. And that was like so important. And so that's something I try to reflect as best I can in my ministry leadership now, is like making sure that it feels like my students can come in on a horrible day, on a good day, and just like relax and feel like they're at home.
For sure.
That's really cool. So now we've kind of introduced Cody, got to know you a little bit. Something I really wanted to talk about. I'm excited for this next part. We're going to switch gears a little bit. I jumped the gun. I have one other thing I did want to ask you.
Okay.
For those in ministry again, what's like one piece of advice that you would give now to like previous Cody, like when you were first starting out? What's something you've learned through ministry that maybe you could go back and fix, or just kind of encourage your past self on, like early ministry Cody?
Yeah. You sent me these questions beforehand, and so I was thinking about them, and I remember this one. I've been doing ministry for a number of years before, and this is my first official I'm the youth minister kind of experience, but I've been doing youth ministry for years before that, just as a volunteer, as an intern. And so I'm trying to think about when to answer. So I guess I've got two answers.
Go for it.
One that I learned the hard way, that kind of sticks with me and God won't let me forget, is no matter your circumstances outside of the church, like if you're working a second job or if you've got stuff going on at home or whatever, the ministry doesn't stop. And you've got to learn how to not bring your baggage with you into the pulpit or into the room with you when you're ministering. I made that mistake once. This is before I was ever officially a youth minister, but I got a lot of opportunities to go up and teach regularly before that. And I remember I was going through a season of life where I was just really stressed and I was overworked and I was getting really bitter about things. And I did a lesson on a Wednesday night and I was just mean. Like the message itself, the truth behind it was true. The content was fine, but it was just, I had a kind of bitter, mean spirit on stage, and I hurt some people's feelings, and that really, like, I really regret that. That's one thing that if I could take it back, I would. But just remembering that, you know, to pause and lean on God's strength for joy and peace before you go on stage, no matter what you've got going on at home, leave that there. One thing I pray, especially when I get to preach, is that the Spirit would be the one speaking and not me.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what I mean when I say that is, God, keep my own biases and my own emotions or whatever out of this to a degree. I want it just to be you. And so that's one thing I would say for sure, just to anybody in any kind of position of leadership or teaching. The scriptures say that there's an added responsibility to it, and that you should take that seriously. Yeah. As far as things I've learned since I've started being the person over the whole thing, not just having opportunities to teach or whatever, but being the guy that has to plan things and all of that. I feel like I thought there was going to be a lot more like structure to it that I was going to walk into. And maybe sometimes there is. In my experience, though, I've walked in and it's like, you know, here you go. It's yours. Okay. What am I supposed to be doing? So, you know, whatever you want to do.
Yep.
And so that was a shock to me at first of just the kind of authority I had and the responsibility to take just these ingredients basically of the ministry and make something of it. There was nothing there to build on. It was just
that's a good way to put it.
Me, yeah. And I had to figure out, I got a budget, how's this money going to be used?
Yep.
I've got this time, how's this time going to be used? I got these students, what are their needs? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? How do I feed them well? How do I disciple them well? All of it's up to me at the end of the day. And figuring out who you can rely on as to be good counsel is important for that. Surrounding yourself with like-minded people to help you serving in that ministry, but also people who are older and wiser and more experienced than you that you can get advice from. All of that, because you know you're going to need it. Yeah, that was a shock that I thought I was prepared for, and I was prepared for it. I had the necessary tools to handle it, but just the emotional response was like, golly, this is a lot.
That's nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
You get in and you're just like, all right, so like, what are we doing? And they're like, well, that's your job. And you're like, wait.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, now the part. So,
okay.
I mentioned how Cody and I, like, we had already known each other, but we really started getting closer because kind of realized that Cody played board games, and I was invited over. We started playing a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons together.
A little bit.
And so saying those words, Dungeons and Dragons, in a Christian space, I feel like sometimes, like, some people have mixed feelings. But yeah, we said we bonded over that, and, like, you mentioned playing PlayStation. Like, we love the Legend of Zelda games. So just what's it like being a gamer or a nerd, but also being a Christian? I like how you put it one time to start off. You said something about, and you can correct my wording on this, you said something about like seeing Christian themes or stories like sewn into like different like games and stories and things like that. So before we get into the controversy, just like what's that like? We've also talked about maybe like balancing time and things, just being a nerd but also being a Christian.
Yeah. Shoot, which question to go with first? There's so many ways to talk about this. I guess I would say, I tend to believe that often games or things like Dungeons and Dragons are works of artistic expression. Some things kind of push that might be pushing it a little bit for some things, but a lot of the kind of games I tend to like explore those kind of more artistic avenues of expression. And my theological beliefs about art are that art is an expression of what someone feels and the ideas that they're are going through their heads and are just trying to get it out there. And art is an invitation from the artist to join them in that kind of journey. And I really believe that all art is inspired ultimately by God's creation. God's creation is the first artwork. And so as general revelation kind of gets out there and God reveals himself through the things that he's made, we're inspired by that, whether you're a believer or you're not a believer. Most people who make art aren't believers because most people aren't believers. But you can still see God's fingerprints on everything.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And so I'm always really fascinated by seeing how people who aren't believers explore these ideas and themes and moral questions with God's fingerprint on them, but without the Holy Spirit in them to really understand what they're asking. I think that's really fascinating to get that kind of perspective. I think as far as helping me be able to talk to and communicate to people who aren't believers about God, it gives you kind of some frame of reference to relate on. I find it really fascinating to look at how believers make these artistic works and explore God's ideas through fiction, and fantasy in particular is my cup of tea. I think of like C.S. Lewis, huge C.S. Lewis fan.
Yeah.
From the time I was a kid, I liked C.S. Lewis. I think I liked him when I was a kid because we've got like the same initials basically. I'm C.H. Lewis.
I didn't think about that.
And the funny thing is my middle name was almost Steven. My mom used to tell me that that was what she had initially thought.
You were almost C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, and so which would have been great. That would have been great if I ever get a writing career.
Yeah.
I could have signed everything as C.S. Lewis and tricked people to make money. I don't know if that's a good thing, but maybe God kept that from me for a reason. Just to leave that temptation from me. But as I got older, I started to really appreciate C.S. Lewis for just the guy he was. He's a really smart guy, really brilliant thinker. And yeah, I just think art and fiction and fantasy, all these things are avenues to explore ideas and values and really the kind of general revelation from God that he's given us through a lens that removes all of the baggage of the real world. I think that's the way I would describe it.
That's so dope. Hey, what I tell y'all, this man is spitting. That's a really cool way to put it. Like, I remember, obviously I could not remember exactly how you put all that, but you've explained that to me before briefly, and I was just like, that hits. I think intentionality just becomes really important too, like talking about how, like, obviously yes, these themes and like what they're built for and how you can still kind of see it, but you just have to be intentional, I think, as well, like with what you're doing and how you're spending time. And so I don't even remember if I wrote that on there, but I know we've talked a little bit about like spending time doing those things, because obviously there's one part before we keep getting in like the more controversial stuff, just about like the content itself, but the other part can just be like, oh well, how can you be a Christian and like spend 5 hours playing a video game or something? Like, so I talked to that because I know we've had that conversation before about like how much time we're spending on these things and just that sort of avenue.
I think you can definitely go overboard on it for sure, but I think you can go overboard on anything.
Anything, yep.
And I think again with with so many things that we enjoy in life, I think that one of the purposes of God's creation is that it is a gift to us to enjoy. I think that's clear in many ways. The fact that just walking through the world, that there's beauty. There didn't have to be beauty. Things could just we could have been made as creatures that have no comprehension of what beauty is, and that making things look good wouldn't mean anything to us. But God wanted us to just be able to see things and enjoy them. The fact that food tastes good didn't have to. There's no pragmatic reason for food to taste good. If it was purely nutritional value, we'd still eat. We just wouldn't enjoy it. It would just be a chore. And so I think there's lots of things that God gives us clearly with a sense of joy and just pleasure for it in mind. But also the good things provide joy and purpose. And so as far as hobbies go, whatever it might be, if it's nerdy things or more traditionally like sports or whatever you do, whatever you enjoy, you can overdo it and you can make an idol out of it.
Yeah.
But you can also take those things and enjoy them at the foot of the cross and use them for godly purposes. And that does take intentionality. And I actually talk about this with my youth a lot because it's just silly. But it makes the point strongly that anything you do, you can give to God. And I guess to kind of foreshadow it a little bit, I spent a lot of time running D&D games. I DM things. And that takes time, a lot of time when you're playing the game. I mean, we play for multiple hours when we play. Recently, we've been playing for like 6-7 hours playing the sessions. That's a long time.
Yeah, we get one day to play, and we're like, all right, guys, we're going to try our best to do as much as we can.
And then outside of that, I take it pretty seriously. Well, seriously. I take it seriously enough as I take anything. And so I spend many hours outside of us playing the game, preparing and kind of building this world out that we play the game in. And I remember early on feeling the need to pray about and ask God, how can I use this to serve you? Can I use this to serve you? And I remember being very convicted going into the prayer that if I can't find any way that this serves God's will and advances His kingdom, then I'm not going to spend this much time on it. And he provided answers. And, not to try to get ahead of any kind of questions you might be asking, but it's provided avenues for, again, just artistic expression. Has a lot of value in itself as far as exploring and thinking about God and His world and the nature of humanity and things like that is good. But then also building relationships with people that I would otherwise not have relationships with, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Like, we kind of became friends over doing this stuff, and there's been a lot of fruit, I think, from our friendship that has been really good. I've built relationships with people who were not believers.
That's what I was thinking about, yeah.
And, they were coming to my house regularly for hours to hang out with me because they wanted to, and then we would talk, and not uncommonly, those conversations would turn to more serious things. And so those were opportunities to share the gospel with people. And then, there's just, with anything in life, you can take it and you can lift it up to God, or you can keep it for yourself.
Yeah.
And there's things that the culture stereotypes as bad or negative, but it's often up to the individual with the intention of the heart. What are you doing this for? What's your purpose?
Yeah, I think just an example of lifting things up over God and stuff. Like, I always think of this one person. I can't obviously I'm not gonna say their name or anything, but there's a person that I see at our gym all the time, and I know someone who works there, and they say this person is there like at the gym, like legitimately like 7 hours a day. Like they'll leave and then come back. And in my mind, I'm like why? Like it has become an idol to this person. Like their life, they identify like over like how often they're there, and they write everything down. They're like microing all of their everything they eat, and it's like it has become an idol to them. So it can be anything, but that's all good. And so now, like, where do you think people kind of get it twisted? Because there's again like this negative idea that some churches have or some believers have in regards to like Dungeons and Dragons. One is like a major thing, but also just sometimes people even go further with like video games or like I don't know, like sometimes I think people when they say like, oh well, you can't like read a Harry Potter book and you're a Christian, just where does that come from, and why do you think that maybe people are getting that wrong or messing that up?
Yeah,
might be time to whip out the Bible on this one. I got it right there.
Yeah, without getting trying to be gentle and respectful. My answer is a little spicy. I think largely it's a lack of biblical literacy. I think for the most part, I think people don't understand a lot of these things in the Bible and are happy to let other people tell them what the Bible means. And that is often used in situations where there's things parents are afraid of, and they go to, whoever they go to for answers. Why is my kid doing this? Or, why did such and such person do that? And poor leaders going out and saying, well, the reason is, instead of, they're sinners, and looking at the theological reasons for why people do things, they want a scapegoat to have a quick answer. And it's easy to point at the stuff that's kind of on the fringe of popular culture and say, well, that's the reason. Let's, go burn those things down. Let's hang those witches. And, and for most of the 20th century, kind of nerdy fantasy stuff was relegated more towards the edge of society. It was something that if you were into it, you were either kind of an outcast nerd, like you couldn't be cool and play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
You could not do it. And so if you were kind of a quote unquote cooler person, if you did it in secret, because you don't want people to find out. And those kind of things people just point at and say, that's the reason why that's the cause of all of our problems, is people playing video games or whatever. And it's just not true. The Bible speaks to all kinds of things, and people take those and try to understand them outside of their context and then just apply them, which is really unhealthy. I think with accusations, I guess talking specifically about D&D, there's a lot back in the day about it being like witchcraft and all this, and my kid's in the basement summoning demons or whatever. And a lot of that's based on, I guess to be fair, people trying to honor God's commands, but they don't take the time to actually try to read and understand the commands before they try to honor. They want to honor them on their own terms. And so there are commands in the scriptures about sorcery and things like that, but that's not talking about playing board games. That's talking about like trying to divine the future through reading the stars. That's when you read in the Old Testament about diviners and sorcerers. Usually what they meant were it was a real like profession people had in that time. People in like Babylon and places like that. Their job was to read the stars and then to counsel the king, basically. Here's what the gods are telling us. This is what's going to happen in the future. This is what we need to prepare for. And the God of the Bible has said, don't do that, because, you will probably be led astray. Be careful with that kind of stuff. Don't ask for answers to questions just out in the ether because you don't know what's going to respond.
Yeah.
I've played a lot of D&D. I don't think I've ever, in the middle of a D&D game, tried to call out to, spiritual beings out in the ether for answers in the real world.
I also think of I think it was Saul that, like, talks to the spirit of Samuel or something.
That's such a weird story.
And Samuel's like when the spirit of Samuel, like, gets, like, temporarily revived or however you want to word it, he's like, what are you doing? Like, you were not supposed to do this.
And then he dies, like, the next day.
Yeah, and I also think of, like, in D&D, we've never been like, all right, guys, let's try and talk to a dead person. Like, this is just not how it goes.
Yeah. And so, I think largely my answer is just people like to spend a lot of time thinking about things that the Bible is not concerned with. And then saying that they're being pious as a result. Yeah. Which I just think is wrong. You end up hurting people. You end up pushing people away from the church. And ultimately, you end up becoming a stumbling block for the gospel. Because people then look at the church and be like, well, they're just people that think playing board games is going to summon demons. Yeah. But I don't want to be associated with that. That seems foolish. And they're right. It is foolish. And that's part of why we have such a responsibility to really take God's word seriously, because mishandled, it can be mishandling the scriptures becomes an obstacle to people's faith, not an avenue for their faith. Yeah. I'm actually I get kind of fired up anytime this gets brought up, because it really is, it hurts people. And we should be really cautious about doing that as the church.
For sure. I think about, like, talking about getting fired up. I like, one time I'm in this, like, Facebook group with, like, youth ministers and stuff, and someone asked, like, hey, my kids want me to play D&D or something, and I was reading the comments, and of course, like, there's surprisingly amount of like, youth ministers that are like, hey, I've played before, or like, I'm not really into it, but my kids wanted me to, so I did it, here's how it went, and stuff like that. And there was, like, that one guy that was just like, dude, you're being deceived, like, all this, like, he was just going off typing a little paragraph. And someone responded and was like, hey, like, I've played it, like, no big deal. And the guy responded again and was like, dude, like, can't you see, like, you're so, like, yoked by this thing, like, it's, like, deceiving you, and, like, how you're defending yourself, and he was just going off, and I finally responded to him, and I was like, maybe you're the one who's being deceived. like, you have these, like, I think you said, like, misinformation, like, one, biblical illiteracy, but also just misinformation of, like, the thing itself, like, is it that big of a deal that, you know, like, Harry Potter, it's just like, oh, like, some fun little book that someone wrote, or, like, oh, D&D, it's just a game where we roll dice and I pretend to be an adventurer. It's like, those things are totally fine. So, like, you've misinformed this thing and also misinformed the Bible. The scriptural example that I always think of is, I think it's Romans 14:14, where Paul says, like, nothing is unclean in of itself. And in the context, he's talking about, like, the people who ate the meat that was sacrificed to other gods. And he's talking about, like, how, like, some people were like, oh, dude, you can't do that. But he was like, well, didn't God make the meat? Like, it's totally okay. But it's like, he was like, if for you, it bugs you and you feel like you can't eat the meat, it's like, then that's not a problem. But if your friend eats the meat and they're like, hey, I know that even though this was sacrificed to another God, God still made it and I can eat it just fine and I don't feel bad about it. Mm-hmm. He's like, both of you are in the right. You just shouldn't be arguing about, like, who's right. Like, you shouldn't, it's like nothing, the meat isn't unclean of itself. But I think about that, like, in the context of war games. It's like, if for some reason for you feel like you can't go play D&D, you would feel bad about it, it's like, then that's fine, like, that's your thing. But if two people are, like, good Christian people and are believers, and they can go sit down and play D&D for a little bit, and they're still godly people, it's like, why do you think that you have to go and rain on their parade and act like it's a big deal? Yeah. I think with that passage in particular, because I agree, I think that is one of the more potent ones to bring up in this kind of conversation. I believe you were referencing the dialogue in 1 Corinthians. And I think one thing that's significant about that is Paul does say everything that you just said, and then he continues and he says, the strong need to carry the weaknesses of the weak. And what he means there is and in my opinion, the strong of faith, those who have understanding, need to bear with the weaknesses of those that are confused, right? And so he's talking about, you know, these Gentile believers who have only known paganism their whole life, and they genuinely believe that eating the meat sacrificed in the temple
is like taking, the spirits of these gods into themselves, and so they have fear because of that. Mm-hmm. And what Paul is saying is that's not what's happening. But like if that freaks you out, then don't do it. And if you are strong of faith, don't belittle them for that. But at the same time, he's saying you believe that because your faith is still weak and your understanding is still small. And the encouragement there is the strong should come alongside the weak and help them, right? Because the weak, being weak in the faith or being of little understanding is not an excuse to stay that way, right? The author of Hebrews would say, I want to talk about deeper things and there's things of more value, but I can't because you aren't prepared for it. You can't handle the spiritual meat. And so I have to give you spiritual milk again and again and again. And it's like this frustrating thing. And so, like, on the one hand, we don't want to, like, belittle people who have mishandled the scriptures or have these kind of fears. But at the same time, we have a responsibility then to come alongside them and help them to grow. And also the humility to be willing to say, there's probably things that I'm wrong about too. And being in conversation with people, other people might have strengths in areas that I don't have. And so there's always blessing when two people filled with the Spirit come together and are open and honest and vulnerable about their beliefs and have just honest, respectful, gentle dialogue. God shows up and he uses that, I believe.
For sure. I think you took everything I was trying to say and just made it make more sense. So that was good. That was a good example.
I don't know about that, but
yeah, so kind of talked about that a little bit, moving on here. Yeah, we went on for a little bit there. We covered a couple of my questions. So I'll say last topic, and then I always end with like the same question, but the last like kind of major topic I should say before we wrap up is just how important is like your quiet time, and how often do you struggle with it, and what's a way you maybe get back on track after missing it a bit.
Yeah.
And when we say quiet time, I guess in case, just to be clear, in case you haven't been in the church for a long time or anything, that's just kind of a phrase for like your solo time with God. Like we call it quiet time. It just means like getting alone with your thoughts, putting your phone away for a bit, maybe reading your Bible. Some people can kind of do like meditation or prayer, but it's just making sure you separate and have time with God. We just kind of call it quiet time, just a different word for it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say quiet time is essential, but I guess the form that takes is very flexible. And where we get at least in my opinion, where you get the biblical, I guess,
picture.
Yeah, of what you should do and why you should have a quiet time. I can't remember the exact verse. I'd have to look it up. But there's a story from the Gospels where, I believe it's in Luke, but I can't remember exactly where Jesus, he's out doing his ministry and he's just working and working and working. And it makes a point of saying, early in the morning, before everybody is up, before everybody is kind of asking for things from him, and before he's dealing with people, he goes and spends some time alone with his Father to find strength and wisdom for the day. I think that is, if that's essential for Jesus, it's essential for us to do.
Yeah.
I think also revelatory about that passage is that Jesus didn't have his ESV study Bible when he went out there. Like he didn't. He wasn't going out there and spending 2 hours, like, deep studying the scriptures necessarily. He was spending time in prayer.
Yeah.
And so what I would say, as far as your quiet time, the only thing in my mind that is necessary is that you have time alone, and that it's time that you can spend in prayer with your Father, to find strength and wisdom for the day. And also just to enjoy being in his presence. Now, Scripture helps with that. I think being in the Word is often, it's the primary way that God speaks to us, I think, and teaches us. I think I think one of the downsides of saying, well, your quiet time is your time in the Word in the mornings. The downsides of that is, well, some people are morning people and they do great, with getting up and being alert and being able to like study the scriptures. I'm often not, in my experience. I know a lot of people who aren't. I'm not a morning person, and so I have seasons of life where I can get up and study the Bible well first thing when I get up, and it's perfectly fine. There's as many other seasons where that's not the case. I'm kind of in that right now. June was, it's the end of July right now when we're recording this. June was very busy and hectic. We had camp, with VBS. I had a vacation that I went on, and so my sleep schedule got all messed up. And July has been me trying to get back on top of that while still being busy, and not doing well. And so often when I wake up in the mornings, I'm like exhausted. I'm not getting up at consistent times, and that hinders my ability to get into the Word and actually really study it. And in the past, that's become an obstacle for me, about having a quiet time at all, because I get in my mind, well, I have to study the Bible to have a quiet time. And if I'm doing it right now, I'm just checking it off a list. I'm not actually engaging with the Word, because my brain is so foggy I can't. And I don't feel that pressure as much anymore. I prioritize starting my day every day with prayer. Before my feet touch the ground getting out of bed, I spend some time with God praying for the day. Beyond that, as far as my time in the scriptures, if I'm in a season of life where I can be having regular daily time studying, I do that. But beyond that, I usually I have just rhythms and patterns of life built into my day-to-day that I'm spending time meditating on God's Word regularly. I'm spending time studying the scriptures regularly. I listen to, really nerdy podcasts, like Bible nerdy podcasts, while I drive a lot. And so I'm spending time in the Word, studying and thinking and meditating on God when I'm driving. When I'm taking walks, doing whatever, taking a shower. And I think that's good. And the downside of teaching people the time that you study the Bible is in the morning when you do your quiet time, is it gives people an excuse to not ever actually sit down and like deeply study the Bible, because that takes time that is more than what is reasonable to ask of a quiet time in the morning. Like, you need to spend time, where you are sitting down and deeply studying the scriptures and really considering it, and meditating on it. And I'm not doing that at 6, 7, 8 in the morning. Mm-hmm. So if that's what I've been taught to do, I'm never going to spend time studying the scriptures. And that leads back into biblical literacy, and that's where you get all this weird stuff to kind of connect everything.
Circling it back,
And so I think encouraging people to have quiet times, absolutely essential. I think the way that we often teach people to have quiet times gives people this pressure that that's how they have to do it, and it's not always helpful.
For sure. That's cool. So I'm actually in a season where I am back in the morning right now for me personally, but I also go through seasons where like morning's not the vibe, but just where I'm at, like kind of this month I've been doing good in the morning. But talking about like listening to podcasts and just that sort of thing, I actually did that just the other day. Like, I don't mix it up that often. Like, my quiet time always looks the same, but the other day I felt like I hadn't done much, and so I went and played disc golf, but I put headphones in and I just listened to a Christian podcast the whole time. And dude, I felt like it was just hitting different. Yeah. Like, it was like sunset and nobody else was out there, and so I was just throwing a couple discs, walking around. I was just like really listening, and I was like looking up at the sky, and I was like, what God made is so beautiful. And I was like, this is dope. I haven't mixed it up like that in a while. So
I'm talking about playing video games. I've been playing a lot of City Skylines recently, which is like a city builder game. And I just turned like the in-game music off, and I've been putting on a podcast. I've been studying through Leviticus in this podcast that's just going super in depth on it. And so I'm building a city and learning about Leviticus, and it's just like,
Yeah.
That's cool. I like that.
Yeah, that's cool. So to wrap it up, truthful ministry, the word truth being very important there. One thing about truthful ministry is just being like open and honest and being willing to like take off like the fake mask that sometimes people put on. But the other part of it is just like kind of what we talked about a little bit more today. How like sometimes the truth can be like a little difficult or like hard to understand or convicting. And so I kind of want to end every podcast with just asking like the guests like, what's one lie from the enemy that you want to kind of speak against? And it can be just in general and just answering that question, but also like maybe something that you feel like in our culture is just kind of getting twisted, and you just kind of want to be like, you just want to speak against that. You want to speak the truth into whoever's listening against that lie.
There's a lot of things that come to mind.
Yeah.
I guess if I had to pick one, I think I would say the lie that living for your own preferences is going to bring you fulfillment. It doesn't. It often leads you astray. I think we should expect the world to do that to a degree.
Yeah.
We shouldn't expect the world to live in godly ways, although we should yearn for them to. I think we've often where our culture is at the moment is in this place of live for what you think is going to bring you the good life.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like. And don't listen to what anybody else says.
Yeah.
What you think is good.
Makes
what
you
you
happy,
think.
like, what your truth.
Yeah. And that's sad. I don't want the world to live like that. As a minister, my heart tends more so to be focused on the church and God's people. And I think we've often let that influence our lives as Christians because we live in that culture. Mm-hmm. And how that often plays out is we obey and follow God in the places that we like to, and the stuff that we don't like, we're happy to kind of leave on the sidelines and not pay attention to, or let other people do, and say, well, that's just not for me. And we use a lot of excuses and be like, well, that's not my gifting, so yeah. I'm not going to serve in this area, even though I can clearly see my church has a need for someone to serve, and I have the time and the availability to do so. And it's like, but I really don't want to. And we cover that up with this kind of gloss of, well, that's just not my gifting.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. But
that makes sense.
I think the scripture that comes to mind for me, and again, I can't remember the exact address, but this is what comes to mind, is the scriptures command us to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth. And what that means, to worship in spirit, means with like a genuine, heartfelt spirit, in step with the Holy Spirit. So not with like a lukewarm kind of energy, but with a fire in our hearts. Mm-hmm. But passion. To worship in truth, to worship in truth means to worship in the way that God has told us to worship Him, to live as a Christian in the way that God has commanded us to be a Christian. And so that's going to be full of things that we really enjoy, but also because we are broken sinners, there's going to be things in there that initially are unpleasant to us. Mm-hmm. And I say initially because as we engage in those things in obedience, the Spirit sanctifies us.
For sure. And
we start to find joy in obeying God.
Amen.
And we really... we shackle the joy that God can give us when we refuse to obey Him. When we say, well, I don't like those things, so I'm not going to engage in it because I don't believe that God has the power to bring me joy in this. And so as soon as the church stops looking exactly how we want it, we jump ship to a different church. Or as soon as a certain ministry starts being unappealing, we jump ship to a different ministry. Or if we know that God's calling us to be studying the Word and it just seems unpleasant to us, we just don't. and we miss out on so much more depth and meaning and value in our relationship with God, and our relationship with other people. I think the lie I would speak to that the enemy has given to the church, to put this in a nutshell, is don't believe the lie that the things that you don't enjoy, you'll never enjoy. If God has commanded you to do it, it's for your good, and He has the power to make you a person that finds joy in obedience. That's been my experience.
That's neat. I would put that like just a big example. I think is seen very often because it's a little more showy, and so people are sometimes more willing to do it. But like I think of the amount of people I know that were really nervous about going on like their first big mission trip, and they were like scared, they didn't feel equipped. Like we had someone in our church. She was like middle-aged, a little bit older woman, not that old, but single mom, and she was like, I really feel like God kind of wants me to go on this trip, but I don't know, like I'm gonna be the only one from our church. I'm going all the way to a different state, and I just feel so nervous. And she was like terrified, and she didn't have the money for it, but she felt like maybe she was supposed to go, and so she was like, I don't know, like I don't think so. And then she was like, well, God, I can't really afford it anyway. And then like over the next 2 weeks, just things happened in her life to where like the exact amount could have covered that, and she was like, all right, well, I guess I'll go. But she was also thinking like, okay, well, if I go on this mission trip again, she's like not like too old, but she's a bit older. She's getting to like that age where she can't really walk that often or things like that, or too much. But part of what they were doing was like building houses and stuff. She was like, what am I gonna do if I go? But then she goes and she comes back and she was crying. She was like, I want to go back. Like it changed my life and like all this stuff. She was like, I enjoyed it. I was busting my butt trying to clean stuff, and then I was doing this and doing that, and she just had like all these cool stories. And I've heard different examples of people doing that with mission trips, especially. But that's just like a big thing. But it doesn't have to be a big thing. I think sometimes it's gonna be the little things where they're like, hey, we need someone to come move 100 chairs at our church, and like you said, you might have the availability and the time, but you're like, I don't want to go. Or we need someone to just literally come and watch these kids. You don't have to do anything. You're like, I don't really like kids. It's like, but you have the time. You'd be surprised where if you just do it, if you feel like there's that opening and you choose to serve, like, I don't think God's going to be like, oh, you shouldn't have served tonight, like punished. Like, that's not going to happen. So if you just take that step of faith and like are willing to serve, that's really good. You'd be surprised like what God can do with just like a willing heart. And I think that's a good way to put it, is just saying the enemy kind of has that lie of like, oh, don't do it, and we miss out on so much. That was so good.
I know where God taught me that was when I was in high school. When I first started going to church, I only went to youth group initially because I didn't want to go to the old person's church as I saw it. We went in there, and I played the drums at that time. And I went into the youth group, and they had a drum set on the stage, but nobody was playing it for like Wednesday nights because nobody could play it. And I remember asking, like, "Hey, I can play the drums. Can I, can I get on stage?" And at that point, I wasn't a member of the church. I was only coming to youth group stuff, and my youth pastor saw the opportunity to kind of blackmail me, and he said, "You can, if you start coming regularly on Sunday mornings, we can talk about it." And I was like, well, I don't really want to do that, but I do want to play the drums. So I started going, and I remember I didn't like it at first. I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it. It was just kind of boring. I didn't really get it. But over the years, like I'm at a place now where because I'm in that rhythm and I've been there and God has sanctified me, I cannot imagine not regularly attending Sunday morning service. I love it, and I get so much joy and revitalization and peace from being regularly attending, to the point that like when COVID happened and everything shut down, we couldn't go regularly. Like that was the thing I missed the most, was being able to gather regularly on Sunday mornings.
A way I would word it too is like another way to word the lie that you've already said is just like the enemy wants you to stay comfortable. I think that's like something that I've been thinking about just like in this last week or so. That's been on my heart a little bit. It's just the idea of like you have to get uncomfortable a little bit. Like I think of Peter walking on the water, it's like, is it scary? Yeah, but like, dude, got to walk on water with Jesus. And so I think the enemy just wants you to sit back and stay comfortable and not get out there, not step out of the boat. But when you step out of the boat, you walk with Jesus. That's been on my heart a lot too. So that was awesome. I think we'll wrap it up there. This has been dope. I can't see without my glasses on how long we're going, but
about an hour.
About an hour? Dope.
Yeah.
That's perfect. God's plan right there.
Amen.
So we'll wrap it up right there. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got something out of this. Leave a comment below if this helped you in any way, or you like what we said, if you have any comments, concerns, or even prayer requests, just whatever you want to put down there. I want to be interactive, so I hope you enjoyed this. Blessings to you all. Thank you, Cody, for coming on.
Anytime.
We'll call it there. And then I'll just cut out this part where I have to go click record.
Cool.
But then Carson had this good idea where I just get a thumbnail real quick. So we just like.
All right. wait.
Dope. And then I'll just screenshot that and make it the thumbnail.
Cool.